I think it's a pretty safe assumption to make that most all of us enjoy sharing a story, maybe about how we made a piece that we're actually particularly proud of right now. Or heck, we enjoy sharing a funny fail story about a flop on a piece that totally got destroyed. At least, once enough time has passed that we can actually laugh about it, of course. Or maybe it's sharing the story of how amazing and mind boggling it is that this blob of mud goes through all these different steps of making, firing, glazing, firing to magically transform into something we use in our everyday lives. I'm sure I'm not the only one who has bored her friends and family after initially getting into ceramics with way too much information about this process. Am I right? I'm just going to assume you're nodding along since I can't clearly see anyone. So now what if I told you all of that storytelling is actually all you need to do in order to sell your ceramics? Ooh, she just used a word that you don't like to hear. Sales. It's kind of a dirty word in the arts for far too long, and it probably makes you cringe. Your index finger might be hovering over the skip button as I speak. But before you jump on over to your other favorite pottery podcast, and I'll pretend not to be self-conscious because of that, just before you do that, what if you ignored your distaste for the idea of sales and simply just told a story? My chat today with Naomi Clement is going to shed some light on how all sales really are, at least when it's done well and perhaps done more naturally than your local used car guy. All it really is storytelling, which actually isn't so bad. Of course, finding a fellow maker who wants to nerd out on business and systems means that I went down plenty of other rabbit holes when talking to Naomi, but that's what you're just going to have to listen to the rest of this episode for. Oh, and real quick, Naomi and I do get pretty passionate and riled up about this whole business of art thing, so we do use some pretty grown-up language. If you're listening around kiddos and don't want to have that conversation yet, I would suggest popping on some headphones. All right, let's get into it now after a quick word from our sponsor.
Hi, I'm Cammie, the purchasing manager at Amico, providing you with everything you need for clay. This episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze or Brent equipment at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Now, on with the show. Welcome to the Maker's Playbook, the show where we talk all about what it's really like to make a living from the things you make. I'm your host, seasoned entrepreneur of 13 years, Rebecca Ikes-Kara. Hey, Naomi. Welcome to the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Rebecca.
Absolutely. Before we get too into it, because I feel like we're going to have a lot of topics and we're going to go all in on business here, how would you introduce yourself to everybody listening?
My name's Naomi Clement. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a full-time potter and creative entrepreneur. And I help other artists sort of find their voices as makers and pursue the creative career of their dreams with confidence. That's my sort of like mission statement.
That is a great tagline.
Yeah. Another part of the tagline is like hoping to debunk the myth of the starving, depressed artist.
Oh my gosh, we could go for an event briefly, and then we should probably not stay for an hour on that subject, because the number of markets called starving artist.
Seriously?
Yes.
Oh my gosh.
I'm like, okay, we've heard really great things about this show from a lot of people in the area. We want to apply, but I'm just morally opposed to the name. Like it's not helping anyone.
That just pisses me off. And I make better work when I'm fed. And I think any artist will say that, and where I can go on a huge long rant about this, but I think there are so many reasons for this whole, this negative idea and that leads to this scarcity mindset for artists. It starts with things like Vincent van Gogh never sold a painting in his life. Like, what a true artist. Like, I'm sorry. I'm sure Vincent would have fucking loved to have sold a painting. Like, maybe he wouldn't have chopped his ear off, you know? And then also, like, through art school, we also don't talk about money. That's like, if you're commercial, you're a sellout, you know, all of this bullshit. And so we're then not taught to think about money in terms of what we're doing as this like translatable skill. Everyone you say that you're going to art school, you know, and try telling people you're going to an MFA, that's even more fun. It's like, oh, well, like, what are you really going to do? How are you going to make a living? So it's like, we're just culturally conditioned that as a society and in general, that artists aren't going to make any money. Add on to that being a woman and let alone underrepresented, you know, woman from a minority group. And it's like, yeah, just this huge mindset hurdle to overcome, I
Yep.
think.
And also, I think a lot of us, I'm going to put my story on here, so maybe not a lot, but I do see this come up, and maybe it's just because it is my story. If you don't grow up in a wealthy area or understanding wealth or understanding finances or, you know, with a whole set of mindsets, there's a lot of guilt around charging. A lot of us have to get over the feeling of like, oh, well, I can't afford this. So how can I possibly charge that much? Which is why I get on such a soapbox about the math behind pricing that, like, yes, it's a little psychology, but it's also math to say you have to charge this much. Otherwise, you can't pay your bills. Like,
Yeah.
it's that struggle between like wanting art to be accessible, wanting to kind of break down so many barriers that have been around for so long, but then also recognizing that in society as we are right now, it's a luxury. It's not groceries. If someone is faced with, do I buy vegetables this week or do I buy a handmade mug? Of course, you're not going to buy. God, I hope they're not buying the mug.
I used to work in sales years ago in a different career. You know, I remember one of the first things my boss told me, I was selling high-end wine. And so like the wine could be like $100 a bottle and you had to sell a case. So like $1,200 for a case of wine. I'm like, that's fucking insane. You know, I'm like shopping the like under 10 bottles. And yeah, my manager and boss was like, you're not your customer. Like, stop selling with your hand in your customer's pocket because you're not your customer. And I think that's a really hard thing for most makers, especially potters. We genuinely believe that everyone should have our work, not just in terms of my ego, but like, I want everyone to use handmade pots. I know how special that is. And I know that it makes a difference in your quality of life. I genuinely believe that. And so to then, you know, be selling mugs for like $150, like, oh, yeah, I technically can't afford to buy my own work anymore at that point. And, but, you know, I agree, we are selling luxury goods, whether we like it or not. As soon as you're selling a mug for more than like $250, for more than whatever IKEA is selling a mug for, you're in the luxury mug item. And, you know, I think unfortunately luxury has this like really negative connotations in our society with like greed and frivolity and, you know, that famous
Excess. Yeah.
consumer of luxury, Marie Antoinette. And, you know, and so we have this like really negative counterculture thing. Like, I don't want to be a luxury item. But I guess, you know, the way I try and spin it when I talk to students about pricing, it's about priorities, right? What are your priorities in life? And yeah, I'm not technically like a wealthy person, but my luxuries, I prioritize like beautiful handmade pots and good food. Like I'll spend, you know, $20 on some fancy olive oil, but then go and get my clothes, you know, discounted or like thrifting or whatever. Like I think anyways, it's about that a bit.
And also, I think if we understand why our pricing is what it is, and we can be genuine about that, as opposed to just like pulling a number off of Etsy or off of what somebody else is doing or whatever, we can understand why we're charging what we're charging and then also kind of help take a step towards removing that uncomfortable, slimy, salesy feeling that so many people are worried about, where it's like, if you genuinely believe in what you make, if you know it's a great quality, there's nothing to feel bad about if someone chooses to spend their money that way. You know, we're not, hopefully, I'm sure some people might, but hopefully, I'm working on unlearning all of the manipulative marketing techniques of psychology and like all of these different things that you can use in a terrible way that there's plenty of products out in the world that are convincing us we need to buy them when really it's just bullshit. But, if you're like, yes, I'm very proud of this piece that I've made. Yes, it's going to be perfectly safe in your microwave and your dishwasher. And yes, it's going to be stunning to have friends. You'll have more friends over for dinner because you're proud of how your table looks. And then you have quality time with them and long conversation. And like, I can say all of that with absolute honesty and then happen to sell a platter, right? As opposed to I don't know. I'm trying to think of pick a commercial, any commercial. Your solution to family happiness is to buy that new SUV or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So I mentioned I used to work in sales, and then I also worked in marketing for a while in a different company. And, marketing is storytelling and sales is storytelling. And what we do is full of stories as makers. And so, I think approaching it from that way, and was on some road trips and listening to a bunch of different business books and stuff like that. And I just started Simon Sinek's Start With Why and watched his TED Talk, which is
Fabulous book.
Totally blew my mind. Yeah. And it's like his quote that he said that I really loved is, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. And I think that's so true for makers and potters. It's like, yeah, people they're not buying a mug when they buy one of my mugs. They aren't. Yeah, ostensibly that's what it's doing. But I think the mistake that so many makers make is that we approach selling our work as if it was a commodity. Commodity is something that sort of has no emotional connection, like a 2x4 or, toothpaste or, these things that we all kind of need and don't really have an emotional connection to. As opposed to what we should be doing is approaching it as that we are selling a luxury good, because that is about storytelling. And yeah, I think the more we can be authentic about telling our stories and really believe it. And that's actually why I was good at sales. I remember when I first got that job in wine sales, my parents were like, seriously, like of all of our kids to be in sales, like you're not super outgoing or extroverted. But it's about one-on-one connection. And so I was actually able to be, pretty good at it because it's about storytelling and sort of one-on-one connection.
I want to go more into kind of your background and history and how you got to where we are today. However, before we get there, I want to double down and have you explain a little bit on what you just said, which was you not being outgoing and yet being good at sales. Because I think everyone's assumption is, oh, well, I'm not an extrovert, right? Like when I'm telling people, hey, here's some tips on sales, they're like, okay, yeah, but Rebecca, you're an extrovert. And I'm like, yes, but it's really easy to come up with excuses for ourselves of why I can't do something, whether that be for whatever reason. And so I think it's interesting to dig in there a little bit because we are such a different personality.
Yeah, I think, and people often are surprised when I say that I'm an introvert, because I think they assume, with all the teaching I do and like public speaking in different ways, that I'm extroverted. And yeah, I think I'm an extroverted introvert, if that makes any sense. Like I have that capability, but it does take it out of me in a way. And so, yeah, again, it's about doing it in a way that's authentic to you. And that's sort of how I've approached my social media stuff too. It's like, this needs to feed me in some way. Like, I don't want to put on my sales hat and be schmarmy. Like that doesn't read it. That's not authentic. I'll feel crappy about it. It won't feel good. And people see right through it. So it's really just about authentically telling your story, I think, and that the personal is universal. And also realizing, and I think you sort of mentioned this earlier, like my market not everyone is my market. Like not everyone is my customer. I geek out a lot on the business and marketing stuff because that's something I'm interested in. And a favorite quote of mine is, the riches are in the niches. And that, being really specific about what you do is actually, it's sort of counterintuitive, but being very clear about who you are and like what your why is and why people should care. I mean, there's millions of potters out there. Like, why should people buy my mug as opposed to someone else's?
Yes. And it's probably a very scary thing for people to think about, because I think people think, oh, well, if I can speak to everyone, then I can have all of these sales, right? There's millions, if not billions at this point, of people on a platform like Instagram. I need to reach them all. And then if everybody buys one mug, I will have all this success, as opposed to speaking to one person, which is what you and I are both saying, and how deep that relationship can be. How, I mean, I think even pragmatically, if you speak to one person and they connect with you on such a level, the customer service is easier. Even if we get super pragmatic about, if I have one person buy a set of 4 mugs, that's shipping to one address as opposed to packaging 4 mugs individually and the labels and the da da da. It can be scary for people, but absolutely that is, especially for those of us with small businesses. We can't compare to the business structure of Amazon and Walmart, and they say, okay, well, they have everything. It's like, yes, they also have billions of dollars of marketing and customer service and teams and employees and all of that. I'm belaboring the point.
Well, and I think I learned early on, like, it's easier in some ways to, I'd rather spend the time figuring out how to sell $100 mug than sell $10 mugs. Another thing I talk about when I talk about pricing with folks is, we underprice our work because we want to skip the sales process. We don't want to have to sell the work, I think, in terms of it is harder, to sell a $150 mug, like the storytelling and the like all of the stuff around that is a different sales pitch than, a $10 mug for sure. But I would rather spend that time figuring out how to do that because this is hard on my body. I'm in my mid 40s now. I feel like the basics to just keep me functional in the studio, keep going, like how much I have to work out and self-care body wise. So like, I would much rather make the work that I want to make and get paid accordingly for it and in a way that's sustainable and like actually getting paid for my time.
Yeah.
Than just crank it out.
And to your point, the cranking it out part is where we get in that commodity space, right? If it's
Totally.
an impulse purchase for someone, they're just deciding on the object as opposed to having a deeper reason and a deeper value connection of why someone is buying something. Ugh, I had another thought, but I lost it as I was listening to what you were saying. So that's fine. Well, before we could clearly just skip any of the biographical information and just go all in. But for people who have never met you, don't know who you are, take us back a little bit of how the heck you went from wine sales to full-time maker. And how long have you been full-time?
Yeah, I've been full-time, I would say probably since 2018. But I actually started making pots when I was in high school. At 16, I went to an arts high school and, then did my undergrad in fine arts. And I think was really disillusioned after graduating. I felt like I was like, oh, I can either be a potter or a waitress. I didn't really want to be a waitress, but I knew how to do that. And being a pot, like just taking that leap and being a potter felt really scary. I did apprentice for a couple of different potters. Also here, I'm based out of Canada, and that's where I grew up and now live. And, there aren't as many opportunities here for young emerging makers. There are more now than when I graduated with my undergrad, but we don't have the craft school system that y'all have. We don't have all the residencies. It's a big country geographically. It's expensive to get around. So it was just there was like one residency I got on the wait list and, that was it. I did apprentice to a couple of potters, but I think I just got kind of disheartened. I was like, I don't know that I love it enough to be poor doing it, I think was the decision that I came to at the time, like in my mid 20s. And, again, not feeling like I was really equipped to do anything else and not understanding, like I never had any business classes in my undergrad, all of that. I had always had an interest in food and wine. I had a boyfriend at the time who was a chef and was getting more into wine. I hated waitressing, but it was good money. But, I didn't want to keep doing that. And so the wine thing was something interesting to me. And then just sort of fell into that. I guess for lack of a better word, did that for a little while and then went to work in marketing for a travel company, a high-end luxury travel company for about 4 years. In hindsight, I certainly didn't plan it this way, but if you're going to be a full-time artist, like having marketing and sales background is kind of the best, that you could.
Exactly.
Yeah, I often joke that those 8 years were in many ways more valuable than my 8 years of formal education in the arts in terms of from a business perspective.
I was
So,
going to say, you basically got an MBA without the little piece of paper to frame.
yeah. Yeah. And so I was in the marketing job and that was a desk job, which I realized like I was just not cut out for that. And I'd been there around 2008 when there were just like a ton of layoffs. And I was like, I'd sort of, I remember we had a new CEO at our company who was really great and he had a creative background and he was talking about, he's like, yeah, you know what? I have friends and I sort of talked about my background in ceramics and the arts. He's like, I've got friends who followed the money, who just went like, you know what? I want to make money. And they did that and they're really happy. I have friends who were like, no, I'm going to follow my passion. And they did that and they're really happy. The people who were like, I'm going to try and do both were really miserable I remember like literally being on the subway on the way home afterwards. And I think I was actually like started crying. It's like, oh my God, I think I'm trying to do both. Like I'm trying to find something that I love doing, but make money at it, it's just sort of reverse engineering, which doesn't make sense. And so, anyways, long story short, I ended up quitting that job and deciding I went to a family friend's farm in Northern Ontario where she had a studio and I sort of worked on the farm in exchange for studio space. And it was kind of the first time that I'd gotten to really make work again. I'd made some work at a community studio prior to that, but like really just spend my days making work. And yeah, I decided I was going to go back to school. I'd always kind of wanted to get my MFA and I was like, I'm in my mid 30s. I don't have a partner. I don't have kids. Like, if not now, when? And so I just sort of took a leap of faith and did it. I went back and got my MFA at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. So I often say that accounts for I say y'all and
That's
a.
weird.
That's
I
where the
was
y'all
like,
comes from.
You said y'all at one point, and I was like, wait, where did that come from? This makes sense now. Okay.
Yeah. So that's where the y'all comes from. But I do say a still. So, and I went back to grad school really because I wanted to make better work, but also thinking, oh, maybe I'll pursue a teaching job just for that sort of stability. And then, I was like maybe 37 or so when I graduated and did pursue, I did some residencies and I did a sabbatical replacement at a university and, all of that stuff. And I think if I'd graduated, maybe 5 years earlier, I would have had the energy to like follow that path more. But I was like, I don't want to live in the middle of nowhere, Utah, to get a job, which is what I would have had to. And again, nothing against middle of nowhere, Utah. I also didn't want to be that far away from family too, back in my parents back home here in Canada. And I was just really exhausted. I think I tallied it up at one point. I had moved 9 times in 6 years, and 3 of those years I was in grad school. I was just exhausted emotionally and like physically from the act of moving so much. And I just didn't have it in me anymore.
That's a lot. Well, and also, as I've learned from friends of mine who are in higher ed or even from conversations here on the podcast, like, unless you're getting a full-time tenured track position, you have to have a passion for teaching, which I think you and I both do to an extent. But at the same time, like, adjunct professor, at least in the US, is not getting you a reasonable quality of life.
Yeah.
It's not, I think for a long time, I perceived that higher ed, I had kind of the chip on my shoulder of like, oh, just because I don't have a master's, I can't go teach, but I have all of this knowledge, like practical, learned on the streets kind of knowledge that I never got in school that would be so great. But just the cost of going back for higher ed to then be paid pennies on the dollar to be an adjunct professor, the math never lined up. And I was like, forget it.
Yeah, and when I was looking at schools, I wasn't prepared to go into major debt for it. Like I wasn't looking at the RISDs or the RIT, the like $30,000 a year tuition.
Yeah.
Like that just wasn't. I have a really low anxiety threshold for debt. And so I was like, that's it. And it also just didn't make sense to me. It's like, not like I'm graduating with a medical degree and able to walk out earning six figures. Like, this is just gonna, and it's also gonna hamper my decisions later on.
So when did you finish your MFA then?
2017 is when I graduated with my MFA. So I guess it was probably more 2019 that I went full time with making work. Honestly, it was the pandemic that sort of forced it. Like, I hadn't really wanted to be full time as a maker, more just for, not that, I mean, I wanted that, but as a single person, it's just stressful and also exhausting and hard physically. So teaching was always going to be part of that in some way. Or, actually just prior to the pandemic, I had bought a house, and I'm always pretty upfront about this. My parents helped me a lot. Like, I wouldn't have my house without my parents' help. They helped me with the down payment and co-signing to get the actual mortgage because I didn't have enough years of like self-employment history for that. I do pay all the costs myself, but I do think it's important to be upfront about those privileges that I have, that I wish that you didn't have to win a lottery to buy a house basically these days. But yeah, so I got my house, moved in January of 2020, was actually looking to get part-time work. I had like interviewed to get a part-time job at a local sort of liquor wine store just to help with cover expenses and not have the pressure all on the work. Because, going back to what I said earlier about we make better pots when we're fed well, like when I start to not enjoy the work and resent the work in a way when I'm like feeling pressure financially. And when I'm counting, like, how much, okay, what is this kiln load worth? What is this kiln load worth? Like, or what is this wearboard full worth? I was getting into that mindset, and it's not really sustainable either physically or creatively. And so, yeah, was getting a part-time job. And then, the world changed and I just moved to a new place. And in many ways, it was like great timing in that, like, real estate is now just insane where I lived. I would never be able to afford the home I have now. And the home I have now, I have my studio in my home. So I had a place to live, I had a place to work. I was back home in Canada.
Where there's healthcare.
And I always, again, when I'm talking about my business, and I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I were in the States, I don't think, because I would, as a single person, like, I would need to get a job with healthcare. And I feel very fortunate for that. And that's certainly a big part of my decision as well. It was like really terrifying time. I don't think we've collectively processed the trauma of those early months as a
Absolutely not.
society. I think that's going to come back to bite us in the ass if it hasn't already. But yeah, it was really scary because everything that I'd planned, like a big part of my income was teaching and like traveling to teach workshops. So I'd had sort of the next 8 months planned out of workshops. And at that point, I didn't have a website where I was selling my own work. The direct sales that I was doing were generally at my workshops. Like, I would teach a workshop and then bring pots with me, sell them directly there. When COVID happened, not only were all those workshops canceled, but also like my ability to sell directly to people was canceled. But again, in hindsight, COVID, I was fortunate throughout it in that living in Canada, and we got really great government support through that. So, and I was able, basically, like, I was able to pause my mortgage payments for 6 months. I mean, I'm paying for that now, but I paused my mortgage payments and got, the government, that was called CERB, Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, I believe. And they made it super easy to get, and was able to just sort of like get my feet under me and figure it out. And then I started teaching the virtual workshops, and that sort of became a whole thing that I really enjoyed doing them. I was good at it. And, in many ways, I often talk to my friends, like, back to the teaching side of things. I basically created the teaching job I wanted. And I remember it was so I'd done that sabbatical replacement in 2018, or maybe it was the fall of 2017, I think. And a friend of mine there, she had just gotten, it was a small liberal arts school in Pennsylvania. She'd just gotten a tenure track job there and, like, done all the things. You moved to the small town, you'd been through, like, jump over all the hoops, etc., get the job. And 2 years later, they like completely restructured sort of did what WVU is doing right now and like axed half of the art department and she was out of a job. So I was like, so you could do all of this stuff. You could get the like,
Jeez.
this dream of a job, move to the place you don't want to do like all of this stuff, and they could still fire you. And so I was like, as hard as it is and as it has been these last few years, like building the business that I have, it's mine. No one can take it away from me, and it's like I'm building something for me. And again, and I've created this basically the teaching job that I wanted, and I don't have to grade, which is like, I was like, awesome. The best.
Or leave your house if you don't
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah. That part is becoming a bit of a problem.
Well, but it's interesting talking about being an introverted extrovert or extrovert, whatever, whichever one. I think none of us are 100% one thing,
hmm
but there is a different energy level when you can, if people can only see you from the waist up and you can sit in sweatpants and record your course material. Not that I do that at all, anyone, then having to be in the room all day and kind of, there's benefits to feeding off that energy all day long in person, of
Yeah.
course, but it also is tiring in a different level than when you're doing it from the comfort of being able to record and re-record when you stumble around your words and things like that.
Yeah, for sure.
So I just want to reiterate for anybody listening, because I know half the time, everybody's got this on in the studio and half listening and they're like, fighting with centering right now and maybe didn't catch the fact that we're basically saying what people see online and know you for, and kind of, I'm actually shocked to realize that this is more or less 4 years full time.
Yeah.
We could say 5, maybe. Now, obviously, there's a lot of education ahead of time. There's many years before the business that we know it as, but just when I like pulled up your Instagram to be like, hold on, wait a second. Right? So, because I think so many people look at someone like you online who's got 21,000 followers. Not that that means anything, everybody, but they look at that and go, oh, well, I'm just starting now. It's too late. But it's like, no, this really, you really focused in on what this is now, what people know you as in the most, in recent history.
Yeah. And, and I listen to your podcast too and love what I think I really appreciate how you talk about the realities of Instagram. And sure, 21,000, that's great. It doesn't mean a lot in that, one of the big things I've learned the last couple of years, and I know this is something you agree with, but a business person I was following said, don't build your business on borrowed land. Social media is borrowed land. I can't control it. I could lose that all tomorrow. If I had to trade, if someone was like, we'll give you 1 million Instagram followers or you can keep your email list, but you can't have both, I would keep my email list.
100%.
So that's what I've really been focusing on more business wise. And I think too, like, and I get how the Instagram thing, like it looks shiny. I remember early on when I was sort of starting to do it more full time and think about that, I called up my friend Eric Botbill, who owns Companion Gallery, and was like, hey, like, how do I grow my Instagram following? I think maybe at the time I had like 6,000 or even less than that. And I was getting workshop requests and stuff like that. So I was like, I want to grow this. And he's like, okay, here, like constant feed in the stories, like post 3 to 5 times a week, better every day, good content, engage with people, blah, 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 all the things. I tried that for like a week and I wanted to shoot myself. I was like, this fucking sucks. This is not sustainable. And so I was like, okay, was this, a shift for me in that I realized this needed to feed me creatively in some ways. Sure, there are times when it's like it's more output, but it can't just be constant output. And also, and I have friends who have the big and, like 100,000 or more Instagram followers. I think for me, what I've always really focused on in the last few years specifically with it is like, I would much rather a smaller following that's really engaged and who are the people that like, I want to be there and that understand what I'm talking about and get it, as opposed to a really big following that maybe isn't super engaged. That is my metric more than anything else.
1,000% agree. because I've now started to see this on the other side, like as we're partnering with other makers in the community and I'm engaging with their audiences directly, like helping them with the tech of courses and things like that, like Tamara's stencil course that we have now and everything. It's a fascinating shift because I feel like I have one-on-one relationships with everybody I talk to, like within
Hmm.
the Maker's Playbook space, of course, within our community membership, but even within the photography courses that I'm teaching. Like, I think we all recognize each other as humans and we're having conversation and dialogue and there's a relationship there.
Hmm.
Whereas when I'm noticing and talking with friends who have the bigger followings, and then also in having this very behind the scenes experience of helping other makers with bigger followings, that goes back to it's so much more commodity feeling. It's so much more someone buying a thing because they want that education, but they want it in a very like, give me this information. Like, not as a, we're going to have a conversation back and forth and let me help guide you. It's a fascinating thing. And I just think about the amount of time and energy and effort that goes into fielding all of those DMs that are very extractive, as opposed to it being a mutually beneficial, a friendship, really, even if someone's buying something from you.
Yeah. And I think, like all pieces of it are marketing too, in terms of like customer services, marketing, like all of that interactions that I do that like I can't ever, someone sends me a DM and I'm having a shitty day and I just don't want to answer. I can't just be like, go screw yourself. Not that I would do that anyways. I'm a Canadian after all, but yeah, with my membership that I have that I started just over a year ago called Maker Spark, it was sort of born out of teaching all these virtual workshops. And also when would travel around to community studios, seeing, people are craving more. Sure, they want the how to, like, but they also want the why. And so that's like something that my membership, it's a monthly membership that we do Q&As and like get to have these bigger discussions about the why of making art and dig into making good pots. Like, again, I'm more interested now as an educator in like, how can we make better pots? There's like taking that last 5 to 10%. And that's where I think the magic is in making pots. It's like really digging into that last 5 to 10% and refining and geeking out on those details. And not only make better pots, but make pots that are yours and, in your own voice. And that's what I'm interested in helping students with and having that conversation. That is a deeper conversation that it's less transactional than just like, hey, show me how you make a mug. A million people can do that as opposed to like, yeah, let's develop a community and conversation and get y'all connected with each other and stuff like that. So
I think this also connects with what we were saying originally. It's fascinating, actually, that it's a very parallel line to speaking to that niche in the people who are going to buy our pots, but it's also a similar niche in from an education standpoint of who actually is interested in having that dialogue and going that extra 5 and 10%. Because I do, and this is not a judgment, this is not a bad thing, because I did this as well when I was first starting and at the community studio and looking online constantly at pottery and being like, oh, I want to make that. And just being in that, I think there's a phase of learning that is straight up copying because you're trying to figure out how did they do
totally.
that. But I think what gets missed a lot is that that's supposed to be a phase and we're supposed to then take that and make it into, how is that going to inform what I make a year from now, 2 years from now? And that's where that transactional commodity feeling can come from when people expect, I'm going to take this course with whoever, Naomi, Tamara, whoever it is, and I'm going to be able to make their pots from it. And it's like, but that's not the goal. The point is, hey, let's help you skip over a few trial and error phases that I had to go through, but still keep going and create this into something else that's yours, as opposed to like, don't just mimic what I'm doing. Cause what does that, there's not soul in that really.
Yeah. And getting people to ask why. So you love my pots or Jen Allen's pots. Like, awesome. What is it you love about them? Like, why do you like them? It's probably different from what I love about them and what resonates with me. And then asking those deeper questions and going that step further. Yeah, those are the conversations that are like exciting and rewarding to me. And partly why I started a longer mentorship program that I have, which is like a 5-month program with a small cohort called Finding Your Voice, which is really about digging in a lot more to the why and your motivations and learning to see and learning to self-critique your work and like all of those things that were, it's hard because again, I think pot ceramics community, it's wonderful and amazing. And we do the how to really well, but there isn't a lot of opportunity for talking about the why outside of the academic setting. And, most people aren't able to, for whatever reason, maybe they've got kids or they live in a remote place or whatever, or just don't, have the financial means or want to go back to school. And so trying to provide a space for people who want to make better work. But, we've all been in those community studio settings and you ask them like, oh, what do you think? And it's like asking your mom what she thinks. It's like, oh, that's great. I love it. No one's going to give you yeah, I really love this part. You know what? Like, what if you tweaked this? Like think about the proportion here. This is really working. Have you thought about X? Like just taking it that step further. And I think there's a lot of people that are really hungry for that. And that's sort of a lot of how I've been gearing my educational offerings. Also, one, because I see a need for it. I think people are hungry for it. And also it's rewarding for me as an educator to have those conversations.
I think it's also really interesting because we're both talking about building places virtually for makers to come together. And what I want to point out to everyone is like, neither one of us see these as competing, which is the exact point we're trying to make also with how you sell your work and the commodity versus the luxury and the storytelling of like, the space you have is a completely different. Of course, people are talking about making inside of our community, but I'm staying in my lane. I'm not doing any wheel throwing tutorials. Nobody wants to learn how to throw from me at this point, let me tell you. Francesco, maybe. It's just two completely different sets of professional experiences and knowledge to have mutually beneficial conversations. It's like, I don't know, I'm not finishing this sentence correctly. It's just interesting that of these kind of 3 different conversations we've had so far of selling your work and speaking to customers, and then also like exploring the work and what each of us are doing pragmatically in our own businesses, it's the same through line of having that kind of focus in what space that we work in, I guess is the point I was trying to make.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it goes back to that authenticity piece too. And like you said, what lights you up and what excites you. Like there's a business book I read and Rachel Rogers, We Should All Be Millionaires, which is specifically geared towards, women of color and financial literacy for historically marginalized folks. And
I was like, nope, it's on the bookshelf downstairs. I'm like, is it still in my room right here? No, it's downstairs. I read it last summer. Yep.
And anyway, she talks about like how we all have, zone of genius, zone of excellence, zone of competence, and zone of incompetence. And it's like spending as much time as you can in your zone of genius. I'm not trying to call myself a genius, but that the zone of genius is the stuff that like it excites me and it doesn't feel like work. I mean, it's like, oh yeah, I would talk about people's pots like day in, day out and like give feedback and geek out on those details all day long. That's been a big shift for me too. That's another thing I like to talk about when I'm talking about running a business. One is the mindset shift of like, I'm running a business. What would a CEO do? And trying to think like that. But then also like, I can't do everything myself. And we were chatting a bit about that before we started recording, but outsourcing. And I remember the first time I did that, like it was such a mindset shift and such a huge paradigm shift for my business too. And that I started with my zone of incompetence, which was bookkeeping. That's the stuff that it's like, I hate doing it. I'm really bad at it. It takes me forever. I have to bribe myself with lots of treats.
Should also be called the zone of stress.
Right. Totally. Exactly. It's like just even thinking about it, like my heart rate goes up. I'm like back in grade 11 math again. Yeah, when I first started outsourcing for that, I was like, holy shit, like I'm paying her $25 an hour. And I remember talking to a friend, like, I don't always make $25 an hour. But realizing like, I'm the only one generating revenue for my business. I wasn't prepared. I've never been interested in hiring someone to help me make my work. I understand lots of people do that. That's not a judgment call. It's just like for me and my situation and my studio setup, that didn't interest me. But to pay someone $25 an hour to do my books or help with, other things behind the scenes in the business, that frees me up to then spend more time marketing and making work to sell or teaching workshops or like doing all of this other stuff. So that was a big shift and one that I'm still expanding on.
Oh, the constant mental game of, are you going to give up time or are you going to give up money?
Hmm.
I think is probably the way in which we could summarize the small business owner experience. That's just constantly the teeter-totter of like, we're going to do one or the other. We're going to do one or the other. Like Francesco and I built our entire booth design, like the furniture, the whole setup, everything in a freezing cold garage in February. And it took us days to do because we also had looked around the internet and was like, $3,000 for shelves? There's no way we're going to do that. And now we're like, oh, that's why those were $3,000.
Right?
Damn it.
Yeah.
But that was the decision we made at the time. And we also did it without feeling in our fingers in the garage in February, which is winter for us, because that was when we had the time to do it. And it's that constant balance. Yes. Also, bookkeeping, taxes in general were the first thing I outsourced.
Yeah.
Highly recommend it to everyone.
Yes. Yes. I love my bookkeeper, Diane. She's lovely.
I also love that I also personally shout out my CPA. I'm like, yay, Terry. We all first name basis. Please never leave us.
Yeah. I know. Yeah. And I've branched out more with outsourcing and stuff. It's not something I talk about publicly a ton. Not that I'm not against talking about it. It's thing about it. I don't know. And maybe it's my own internal hang up and maybe it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier around these negative ideas of money in the field and that talking business is that you're a sellout if you're financially successful. And that means you're, commercial and commercial is bad. And I feel I'm sorry, who's saying this? Who made these rules is probably a bunch of old white dudes who are professors who really easy and convenient for you to make that decision because you've got an academic job and, aren't out here actually grinding it out, having to pay your mortgage with your work. So anyways, yeah, that's a bit of a tangent, but I often don't talk about publicly how much I am outsourcing to other people. I have a virtual assistant who helps me with all of my email marketing stuff. I do all the content, I do all the writing, but she helps with all the scheduling and behind the scenes stuff. And I've just hired someone part-time, it's all part-time contract folks to help me with the membership. Actually, I had my best year ever last year and I was sort of oh, wow, that was awesome. But I was also I can't sustain that, that level of work and just constantly working just wasn't sustainable. So, I started working with a business coach about a year ago and, that's outsourcing as well, I suppose. And that was another big paradigm shift and big up leveler too, and game changer in terms of, again, thinking about it as a business and thinking about what do I want from this long term? Again, I'm a single human. I have bills to pay. I'd like to not have to work until the day I die. All of these things. It would be nice to actually take a vacation someday.
That doesn't involve a workshop.
That is not around a workshop. That's my big goal.
I was just thinking about this because we just booked flights last night to go visit my very dearest friend who's in Seattle now. And I was like, oh, maybe I could do no, don't. We're going. We're not even there for that long. We're there for 4 days. I am not going to sacrifice one of those days, even though it would be way more financially savvy to do a workshop. We're not doing it. I'm there for my friend. That's it.
Yeah.
But that's huge because I think most artists, and this kind of goes back to the whole reason of these conversations on the podcast, most people see the top level, ooh, we went to Australia, or ooh, we're doing all these fancy things. It's yeah, we did that because we then did a workshop while we were there, or we did this, or we had this going on at the same time that was actually bringing in revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. Or, my favorite thing as a business owner, though, is a write-off. I love me a write-off. All my friends know that. Again, I think a CEO with that shit. My coffee, no. I write it off because it's that's if I had an office outside of my home, I would be buying coffee for the office. Yeah, I write off my pottery purchases too, research and development.
I agree with that.
Teaching tool.
Although I will say, I think a lot of people do that thinking that like, oh, then that's free money. And I'm like, no, like you don't get 100% of that back, guys. Like
Yeah.
it's definitely a write-off, but let's just think about this still.
Yeah, have you ever seen that scene in Schitt's Creek where Dave, I don't know if you've watched Schitt's Creek.
Not that much, but I
Anyways,
know it.
I'll send you the link, but he's talking about like the write-off and his dad was like, no, you actually still have to pay for that. It's not free. It's like, I don't know, like the write-off people give you the money. It's like, no, like it's your money that it's just, again, you're writing it
Right.
off against your overall income.
Right. Oh my gosh. I love it.
Anyways.
Well, since we were talking about delegating, let's talk a little bit about what the reality of kind of your time looks like with, because you do have so much going on. We are similar breeds. So between studio time and doing all of the virtual workshops and the education and things like this, how does that actually all pan out into what your, I hate to say daily life because I feel like every day isn't necessarily an exact same schedule, but just in general, what that kind of time split looks like.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I get asked that question a lot. It changes a lot depending on the time of year. And I haven't been in the studio a ton of late because I was kind of burned out with it. And that, was also a bit of a shift that I had been working on with my business coach, was wanting the work to get that joy and excitement and creative energy from it again, as opposed to it constantly feeling like this output. So I've sort of been off and on in the studio of late. But yeah, typically Mondays are like an all office day, regardless of the time of year, working on things that are coming up. I do a lot of emails, like email marketing. Again, I geek out big time on that. I enjoy it. I like the writing. And so yeah, Mondays is a lot of that. I do with my membership, we do a Q&A every month, and then they get a workshop every month as part of their membership fee. Sometimes those are guest artist workshops. So it's also like coordinating like what's coming up in the workshop, like back and forth with artists about that, figuring out scheduling for Q&A. Sometimes it's processing videos, like, there's all of that like super unsexy stuff behind the scenes that needs to happen. And then I do usually try and it's hard and I'm guessing you can relate. The admin stuff is just like never ending. Like I could be in my office like 60, 70 hours a week and it would still not get done. So something that I need to do and is like, I'll just schedule out my week sort of roughly with like blocks of time. And, something I've also started doing for a little while now is like, used to be, I'd be like, oh, okay, I can take a meeting whenever, like if I'm meeting with an upcoming artist or like podcast thing or something like that, I can do that whenever. I work from home. I can just come up from the studio. And it's like, no, that's a whole different like task switching. Like once I'm in the studio zone, I don't want to have to get out of it because that creative output is very different from admin output. And so really trying to be like, okay, these are my studio afternoons or these are my studio days. Obviously, if there's a show coming up, it's a bit more of a crunch and that's a bit more fluid. I do try and take weekends, definitely take Sundays off. I try and take weekends if I can. Although some like these days now, because I haven't been in the studio as much for quote unquote work, I've like, oh, it's Saturday. I'd actually kind of like to be in the studio. So I'm just going to, do that in the studio. And so it's kind of fluid. It's a lot less studio time than you would think. A good week would be me getting, 2 full days in the studio or, 3 would be a really good week. And again, part of that is sometimes I think I hide in my office when I'm feeling stuck in the studio, it's like easy to feel busy and like productive with the admin stuff. So that's certainly something that I'm working on. And it's like, again, with my business coach, we had talked about, okay, like it's hard for me to like take time off just for a lot of reasons from an admin perspective and just as a business owner, it's hard to do that. She was like, well, let's take Fridays off in the summer. And so we booked them off and it's like, I end up working for a couple hours. And so anyway, so rambling on, but
there are so many parallels. I think even with some of the books you were mentioning reading and I think we are on parallel but slightly opposite tracks where I've spent the last 10 years on all of the business, like definitely deep dove Simon Sinek years ago, like all of these things, but never was asking myself the art questions, right? The whys and the making that I think when I look at your work, you've explored in formal settings that you're now providing for people to explore in more, I guess, I was going to say modern, but whatever, in a virtual setting. And now you're kind of going into this deep dive on the business, and I'm trying to get more into the like making. So I was nodding. Nobody could see me as I was like nodding and smiling along because I'm like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
yep. And also the computer work for me feels safe. Like I know how to do it. I can tick the task off the list, and at the end of the day, I can look at my paper or my Asana or whatever and say like, look at all the things I did, and it's a safe space as opposed to sitting down at the wheel and cutting absolutely everything in half. And then all I have to show for it is a lot of reclaim.
Yeah. And again, it's interesting though. Like, I think I would actually be more productive. Like, I've started to get better at noticing when I'm just kind of spinning my wheels with the admin stuff and not being productive and just being like, okay, like, I got to go out in the garden now. Like, or I'm going to go to the studio, or I'm self-employed. So this is one of the big reasons I want to be self-employed is so, it's August. Maybe things are a little quieter. I can go to a cafe
Go for a walk.
and like, go for a walk, bike ride, like go read a book, stuff like that. I'm starting to get better at that because I think it does then make me more efficient with my time. And so I need to be better at, the work-life balance is an ongoing thing, I think, for any business owner, but protecting the studio time can be hard unless there's a deadline. But yeah, it's interesting in sort of like preparation for this. I was looking back at some of my like business stats and like how my income is divided and and I do teach a professional practices course where I sort of like talk about the business side of art too, because as we've talked about, like I didn't get any in my 8 years of formal education. I got like no courses on like running a business. In some ways I get that in that it's a whole other like as you were sort of referencing, like making art is a whole other thing. And to try and do it all at once they're just such different mindsets, but it's still, I don't know. I still think the system is flawed.
Well, because there's a difference between like, okay, nobody's expecting to walk out with an MFA and an MBA. And I actually don't think you really need an MBA personally, because it's not so much of that is not practical to what we're doing. But at the same time, it would be different and I am starting to see this shift slowly because I am starting to like get emails of asking me to speak in classes and talk about professional practices. And I'm like, wow, undergrads are having these conversations. That's amazing. Because that wasn't the most I had. And I wasn't even studying fine art. I was a graphic design major ultimately. That's where my degree ultimately is, commercial in and of itself. And so that's kind of they're expecting you to go get an office job with that. But even still, our preparation was, how are you going to put together your portfolio and how are you going to design your resume so it sticks out from the crowd? Like that has nothing to do with anything now at this point for me. It would still just be different if the tone and the culture and the air around it didn't feel so like, well, why are you thinking about selling your stuff? Why are you worried about that? And it's like, well, why do I want to buy groceries? I don't know. My stomach is grumbling. So, and I think the really big thing for me too was I distinctly remember this moment being downtown Chicago, I had volunteered for the morning for a cause that that I still, not past tense, that I believe in, that I wound up sitting at the cafe that I worked at when I first started my business because I hadn't taken out business loans or anything. And so I was doing all these part-time gigs and I had, instead of getting one for free because I was there at 4:30 in the morning, I had bought a coffee. I was sitting in this cafe and I was realizing that because I had finally gotten to the point of charging what I needed to charge and charging what I was worth and that what was reflective of what I was bringing to the table for people, I was able to take the 2 hours off that morning and go do something that was meaningful for me. Whereas a few years ago, there's no way I could have said yes to volunteering that time because I had to be so strict and so protective of my time and making sure I was getting paid for every minute and like where it was a weird dichotomy, or as you were saying, like a paradigm shift of like, oh, if I charge more, I actually can show up in the world the way that I want to show up and be more generous, as opposed to charging less and always being worried about, like a friend of mine and I were kind of trying to get started at the same time. And we both were saying the marker of success was going to be when we could go out to dinner with our other friends who were like traditionally employed and just everybody toss in the card and say split it and not worry about whether or not they had bought a glass of wine, but I hadn't, or I didn't eat as many of the appetizers, or, whatever, like the dollar and cents parts of it. And that came when I actually charged, when you actually got comfortable with charging more and outside of what you could afford, which feels backwards, but there was just so much more freedom there.
Yeah, and I remember, I forget who said it, but another business person that I was, listening to a podcast or something, and they were like, your price is part of your branding. And, that's a really interesting thing. And I think, again, it's not something we think about as makers because we're so uncomfortable with the concept and word luxury. I wish there wasn't such a like knee-jerk response to that. But it's hard in that, again, I also want people to use the work. So I get that if you're, charging $300 or something for a mug, it becomes maybe harder for people to use. And so there is some back and forth with that. But yeah, I always, I think about it a lot with functional work and, work on the wall. It's like my, the template for my cups are like a certain size, maybe, I don't know, 10 inches by 6 inches or something like that. And I often, when I'm cutting out the template for making the cups, it's like, oh, if I were to just like cut this out as a slab of clay and like paint that and like stick it on the wall, like, yeah, you could, $150, $200 for a painting is like, oh, that's a reasonable
It's a
painting.
good deal.
Like, that's a good deal.
Yeah.
But as soon as it's like, okay, I'm going to then make that painting into a cup and it's something you can actually use every day. It's something I think about a lot. And when I do an artist talk, I talk about this. And a statistic I heard was that the average amount of time any given person spends in front of a piece of art in a gallery or museum is about 17 seconds. And I always say, I would take like my day in, day out interactions that people have with my work over that 17 seconds any day. Like people could potentially spend decades with the objects that I make. And that's really special and in a super, intimate way that's part of their life and their story. And yeah, that's a big motivator for me as an artist. But I think it's such an interesting thing to think about. And I often, again, when I'm talking about pricing with students in my professional practices course, or sometimes I talk to school groups too, it's like I try and think of objects that we use that are, because I think with pottery, because of the fragility, there's this inherent sense of, well, I don't want to spend that much money on it because it could break. But like parallels I think of in the luxury goods world, like purses or shoes, like, people spend, I'm certainly not one of these people who spends $10,000 on a handbag, but Chanel has told people that that's like, people spend $10,000 on a handbag, and that's a functional thing. That it's about status though, too. I was sort of hoping with the like Zoom and pandemic that like the mug would be the new like status symbol, but I don't know. We didn't quite get on that.
We didn't think through that marketing strategy early enough to be able to capture.
Yeah.
That's hilarious. I can think of the times that I have, there's brands that I know just because they're universally known that I have photographed. Like when I watch somebody open a pair of Louboutins as a wedding gift, I'm like, okay, got to be careful with the way I photograph those guys. But then there's other ones that are such a status symbol that like I looked up later because this is a random pointless story, but it's just so ingrained in my brain because there was this bridesmaid, I take all of the different objects that people have chosen and photograph them before people get dressed and blah, blah, blah. And there was this pair of shoes that like the bridesmaid kind of like walked over to me and then stayed in the room with me and then took them back. And I was like,
oh, wow,
they're just high heel. Like they weren't Louboutins. They weren't Jimmy Choo's, whatever. They're a brand I had never heard of in the planner. And I looked them up later and went, oh, that's why it was like, okay, that is why there was a person to take care of the shoes.
They had a handler
to make sure they didn't get like, She changed out of them before she walked out of the hotel to get into the cab. We put them on just for photo. Like, I was just like, but what's the point?
Right.
But yeah, similar idea and similar experience that we're even having with people at markets who don't even want to touch the pots when they walk past the booth. They're like, oh, I don't want to break anything. And I'm like, okay, that's feedback that we have to figure out, to your point in the very beginning, of how do we talk about this? How do we tell the story? Because you're supposed to come up and touch them. You're supposed to pick them up. Like, odds are you're not going to break them. Yes, your child can pick it up just with two hands. They'll be fine. They're not going to just like let their hands loose and have it fall on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
Like, it's okay. But that takes a lot of effort on our parts to educate people. And I don't think a lot of makers are taught or know to expect that, like, part of our job is that educational aspect.
Yeah, it's sort of part of why I started doing my Dishwasher Diaries series on Instagram. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those.
No,
but
I'm like, I need to see these now because I love that name.
It's me unloading my dishwasher.
Oh my God, I love it.
Honestly, it had started like back in the early days when video became a thing on Instagram, and was like, okay, well, maybe this is a way to create some video content in a way that's like actually interesting and fun for me. It started as that and then just became fun. And it's also like me, it's kind of I love geeking out about pots. I've talked about this, like the little tiny details. And so I talk about like, oh, this is the bowl that I use for this, and this is why I love it for that. But also showing people like, yeah, I use pretty much all handmade pots, but they are in and out of my dishwasher. There's maybe a few that I hand wash for various reasons, but yeah, they're in and out of my dishwasher. And I use them every day, and these are meant to be used. But yeah, it is part of the education piece for sure.
Well, I know that you and I could go down a million more routes of so many different things, because being self-employed is bananas.
Indeed.
But also great. Sorry, guys. And I want to be conscious of your time. So for people that haven't found you online, where should we send them once they wipe the mud off their hands?
Yes. NaomiClement.com is my website, where you can learn about all the things, the courses that I teach. I sort of, as I said, do everything from the like how to, like, mugs, cups, bowls, I focus more, I'm a hand builder, so it's predominantly that. And then my membership and mentorship, and then, professional side of things that I teach is all there. And then on Instagram, it's Naomi K. Clement.
Somebody had Naomi Clement already.
I think so, yeah.
Jerks. Thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, I would love to say one last thing, if I can give people some advice business-wise, that I always think it's important to talk about. And the pandemic sort of forced this on me, but is launch ugly. And I think that is something that I really learned, and a lot of business people talk about. And prior to the pandemic, again, it's like, oh, I need to think it out. Like, I need to do it perfectly and think about all the permutations of everything before I do it, as opposed to just do it. And you learn so much by doing it. Like with the business, like, again, my business is very different today in terms of all the systems that I have than when I first started. It was pretty simple, and you can start really simple and just learn and grow as you go. And I always learn, no matter how much I try and anticipate all the different permutations of a new thing that I'm doing. Inevitably, it's like I click launch and I'm like, oh shit, I didn't think about that part. Right. But then you figure it out, and again, it's like iterating quickly and just figuring it out. And like, that's what most of life is just kind of figuring stuff out and doing things and seeing if it works. But I think we get so afraid of it. So that would be one of my big pieces of advice for people, is like, just launch ugly and just fucking do it. And you can always change later. Like, it's not set in stone. You can stop, you can change directions, you can add new things.
Oh, agree completely. I also think this is the benefit of, people are so interested for whatever reason in like going viral or whatever. And I'm like, but there's such a benefit in starting before there's massive number of eyeballs on you, because then if I have a typo on my homepage and, 2 people went to the website in the first hour it was launched, no big deal. I change it and nobody knows.
Right.
Like, absolutely.
Yeah.
Couldn't agree more. Awesome. Well, thank you. I know we could keep going forever. So I was like, okay, I have to just like intentionally stop.
No. Well, as I said, I love sort of talking about business stuff. It's, again, and I think it's so important what you're doing with the podcast and like having these conversations about business to sort of make it feel less intimidating. And also, like, you can't get somewhere if you don't know where you want to go. And if you don't, I think the more of us that talk about these things and the realities of it's like, you can figure it out. You can do it. It's doable. I don't have a business degree. I don't come from an entrepreneurial family, like all of that stuff. And you just kind of figure it out. But like, talking about it helps other people see what's possible too.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah, thanks. It's been a delight.
I clearly could not agree more with Naomi's final piece of advice. Just start. You'll figure it out. And then, more than likely, you will also iterate or change or update something pretty quickly after you start. And that's normal, because you'll actually have some information and feedback on how whatever it is that you're starting works in real life. Whether it's a public Instagram account, a website, an Etsy account, or a whole darn business. I know it's nerve-wracking. I know it sounds crazy scary to put yourself out there when something isn't perfectly prepared, but the momentum from simply starting cannot be overstated. And remember, this is coming from a recovering perfectionist. I'm still working on it too. If you have loved this chat and want to keep talking all things business and the realities of how the heck we make a living from the things we make, come take a peek inside of the community to see if it just might be the right place for you. We now have over 70 makers from all over the world supporting each other. You can learn more and take advantage of our 2-week free trial at makersplaybook.com/community. Also, Naomi is offering a free live webinar of her own coming up here very soon. So if you're listening along in real or almost real time, and we've convinced you that selling your pots can be as simple as telling stories, well then, on October 4th, Naomi is hosting Artist Statements 101, Why You Need One and How to Write It. In the webinar, Naomi will explain why an artist statement is your secret weapon, no matter where you are in your creative journey. Plus, and this is my personal favorite description for this webinar, she's going to teach you how to pour your heart into writing an artist statement without, and I quote, coming off as a pompous jackass. End quote. You can find out more in the description of this episode, where I'll put a clickable link so you can just take your time wiping that mud off your hands, figuring out where the heck you left your phone. Although if you're anything like me, it's probably in your pocket the whole time, even though you're clearly going to search the entire studio and the house before you realize that. And then click on to whatever app you are listening to this episode and find all the helpful links in this particular episode description. Or, if that's too complicated, you can just always DM me at The Maker's Playbook or Naomi at Naomi K. Clement on Instagram and say, hey, where was that link for the thing that you mentioned in the episode on the podcast? That totally works too. And, if you have opened Instagram already, now that I've mentioned that, you might as well share this episode and tell us what your favorite takeaway was in a post or a story so that other maker friends can come have a listen as well. Okay, that was way too many call to action items at the end here. That's not at all best practice for what I should have been doing, so let's do a quick recap. Number 1, if you love this conversation and don't want it to end, come have a peek at the chats happening inside of the community. Number 2, if you want to learn more about how to talk about what you make without sounding annoying and why having an artist statement is important, check out Naomi's free live webinar coming up on October 4th. And number 3, last but not least, if you aren't on an Instagram sabbatical right now, we would love and appreciate it if you shared this show in your stories or feed to help spread the word to other makers. All of the links for all of these things can be found in the description of this podcast episode on whatever app you are listening to. Okay. Of course, this was all made possible in part thanks to the support from our sponsor, Amico.
Hi, I'm Cammie, the purchasing manager at Amico, providing you with everything you need for clay. This episode is brought to you by Amico Brent. Find your favorite Amico glaze or Brent equipment at your local distributor. Happy glazing!
Audio post-production of this podcast is made possible by help from Christy Kotzvan, with promotional material assistance from Queenie Maliki. The Maker's Playbook podcast is recorded on the original homelands of the Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee people, where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Until next time, my friends, go get back to making your dreams a reality. Because together, we've got this.